Okay, next up we have Dr. Julie Rudner. Dr. Rudner is a lecturer in the Community Planning and Development Program at the Trobe University in Bendigo and has over 10 years' experience as a professional planner and consultant. Through her groundbreaking work, she seeks to understand how adults, children and young people can expand their confidence and skills to engage with their environments and their communities. This has involved exploring children's and young people's views and experience of their environments. She also promotes cities as sites for experiential learning and supports children's and young people's citizenship through participation in planning and urban design. Dr. Rudner is particularly interested in how we create a public knowing of risk that limits our freedom, and especially the freedom of children and young people to use public space independently. And today she is presenting on the risk-safety paradox, how safe is safe enough. Can we please welcome Dr. Rudner?
No, that's good. Thank you. Hello, and thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it. I guess in some ways I'm talking about the sorts of cities we want to create for the future, and I'm obviously ahead of myself because I think it's the 11th of June. I would like to thank you all for having me, and also the elders past and present for welcoming us here today. I guess I'm presenting something quite different from the previous presenters and what many of you are here for. Many of you are working with the problems that we're trying to alleviate in our society and the harms that people experience. I guess I'm coming from the other side. I'm looking at the great majority of people who are quite functional and what their role is to play in creating safer cities. And I think the reason why, for me, I'm really attracted to this is because politically, at all levels of government, we tend to use, and in our media, use safety and fear as a way to get support for political agendas. And there seems to be a lot of attraction to use danger as a way to manipulate people's emotions and get them to think certain ways on issues. And it makes me question, really, are we that insecure, or are we safe enough? And I guess that's a problem that I'm always playing with, because part of being safety means that it inherently includes notions of risk. And in which case, what does that mean? For a show of hands here, how many of you drive regularly? Okay. How many of you get frustrated with traffic because it's too slow? Okay, can you please tell me how many kids you are willing to kill each year to maintain your current driving habits? It's an uncomfortable question, isn't it? But it's true. Any traffic engineers here? Okay, well, have any of you looked at a traffic engineering status or policy and how they operate? There are actually calculations on this. There's calculations as to how much money is put toward a problem, how many people will be killed at a site before something's fixed. Everything that we do in our society, all of our privileges, there's also some costs associated with that. And so I guess that's why I'm very curious is how safe is safe enough. Because when we're thinking about safety, it's also about social exclusion. And that might be a bit of a difficult thing to fathom. But within this, there's a lot of people who are excluded from our society, namely the 25% who are under 18 years of age. They aren't actually considered citizens. And although we want to protect these citizens or these young people, in doing so, we often take away their agency as well. So I think today, hopefully, I will potentially annoy some of you to come and argue with me over some things, just because I like a good argument on some of this. But I'm hopefully challenging all of us here to really think about what we're creating and how we're going about doing it. I'll see if this actually works. It does. So in terms of setting the scene, I come from a planning background, community planning, spatial planning, urban design, and where that fits in is, I guess, through crime prevention through urban design. The people who work in that area would be a bit more familiar with what I do. And also with health, we know that our physical cities contribute to our sense of safety and our health. And as I said, my key questions really relate to what does it mean to be and feel safe? What's the relationship of safety to risk? And to what extent should we feel safe? And I think that we really do have to consider this because of those who we exclude. Because in that exclusion, we can also support disenfranchisement. And that's not exactly what we want to do in our societies. I've traveled to many places around the world, and I've seen what some of that can result in terms of daily mobility. I left Johannesburg because I couldn't just walk the streets. And I found, I did walk 5 kilometers to change my ticket so I can leave early. And it was amazing how many people were quite scared for me. I got the best directions in my life to ever get to the travel agent than I've ever gotten before because of real concerns. And in Melbourne, we're really lucky. In Australia, we're really lucky. And I think one of the things I want to remind us about is we are lucky. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't support and continue our work to improve and support the lives of people who are less fortunate. But I think it's important that we keep this in perspective because we have a lot to build on. So I guess the question for me really is, what is safe? So looking at the Macquarie Online Dictionary, sorry, I just realized I like to set a timer so that I don't overstep or bore you to death with my wanderings. Secure from liability, free from hurt, involving no risk of mishap, dependable or trustworthy, cautious in avoiding danger, placed beyond the power of doing harm, a steel iron box or repository, any receptacle or structure. There's something missing in that. What's missing in that? I would say it's agency, choice and agency. And choice and agency are really important when we're dealing with these issues. Because choice and agency are what gives us our value systems as to what we choose to do or not do, and the trade-offs that we make and the decisions that we're partaking in all the time. And in which case, if we look at safety and if we look often at definitions of risk, that notion of choice is taken away, that notion of agency. So if we move from safety and start to think of risk, because risk starts to bring in some sense of decision-making, some sense of challenge, we have a few definitions. Now, risk is not chance. Chance is random. And we do have random events, and we often are faced with the issue when a random event happens, if it's traumatic enough, without trivializing the trauma or the danger or the event that's occurred, do we make policy or do we not? Risk is not a hazard. A hazard might be different for different people at different times. It's not an impact, it's not an outcome, it's not an uncondoned or bad decision, and it's not a possibility. If you really want to understand risk, it's actually, from my favorite definition, it's a situation or event in which something of human value, including humans themselves, have been put at stake and where the outcome is uncertain. And it's also a calculable probability. So if we look at this, suddenly we're put in a different context. We have different value systems. We have different trade-offs. And this is where it starts to become complicated in managing our cities and managing cities for what we mean by safe. Because if people have different values, different willingness of trade-offs, they want different things from their cities. So you might have teenagers who look at each other as small groups and feel uncomfortable about the way others dress or how they talk or how they behave. And they might feel uncomfortable. And they might feel unsafe, but does that make the city unsafe? If you have the same sorts of tensions between older people and younger people, visual migrants and non-visual migrants, when I say visual, I'm saying different from ourselves, we start to come up into conflict because who are we designing safe cities for? Who has the right in having a say as to what safety is and how it should be kept? So instead, I guess I'd rather look at our cities and say, okay, well, we might be uncomfortable at times, but it's a place of diversity. So how do we manage this diversity? And in which case, it's about creating a different sort of city in many ways. A city where people can feel a sense of self-efficacy and competency. And self-efficacy is different because instead of it being something passive, like someone who is safe or protected from something, if we look at competence and self-efficacy, it's about knowledge and skills. It provides us with the opportunity for social learning, to actually gain experience, to evolve, to grow, to share that knowledge. And in which case, it gives us opportunities to create rather than to wait. So if we look at risk as a relationship between what we intend to do and how we want to use the environment and the capabilities that we have to use that environment, we then decide for ourselves what the trade-offs are and the costs and benefits in order to get what we want. Just to give you an example, if you are an able-bodied person and you want to go from up or down a flight of stairs, often you can walk and do so quite safely with minimal hazard or opportunity for falling over. If you're in a wheelchair, you're probably less capable of going up and down those stairs, and if you tried to do so, you might fall and harm yourself. If you're a skateboarder, you have a different set of skills, so you might choose a myriad of ways to travel up or down those stairs. Is your potential for falling higher than if you walk? Yes, likely. However, because you've mastered a skill, if you do fall, you're more likely to regain your footing, collect your board, and be able to try that trick again without harming yourself, or with minimal harm. However, if you're me and I don't skateboard, if I try that same trick, my capabilities do not match how I intend to use the environment and what will happen to me. So I guess what we have to remember when we're talking about these things is something called a risk thermostat. Where's yours set at? Where is our community set at? What are we publicly creating through our news media, through schools, through politics, through our daily conversations? And what is our acceptability for risk? And I think in some ways, when you look at urban design, it's not just about the central areas in the city where we might meet and congregate. It's through our housing choices. It's the fact that we can choose to buy public schooling, buy certain events and activities. And within that, we've been told that there's a lot of polarization occurring in our economics in Australian society. It's one of the fastest in the OECD countries. And if we look at that, it worries me about the future of our cities. And the reason why is because we separate ourselves from those who are other, people who we may not understand. And so we might be creating for ourselves a social trap where we have this greater concern for our safety. And so because of that, we might take individual responsibility for ourselves to keep ourselves separate. And when it comes to our kids and perhaps others, we might protect them from making their own decisions about where they go, what they do. And in which case, the increase in surveillance, mediation, control that might result may not be the things that create the society that we want. Images of gated communities, highly restricted. And when I was in Cape Town and when I've been in Sri Lanka and other places, the amount of security, individual security on people's homes is phenomenal. Maybe because of my ignorance, and I do walk the streets. I'm often flabbergasted by that, and I think, is that the society that we want to create? Do we have a chance of creating that in Australia? And I think that possibly we do. We share quite a common background with Canada, the US, New Zealand, and England. And out of all of those, which country do you want to follow in terms of how we demonstrate through our built environment and our built form our level of safety and security? And how do we want to use those spaces? And I think one of the best protective factors, because that's one of the terms, I guess, within the field, I actually think is independent mobility, our bodies in space. It's political. It sends a message. People in space says, this is safe. It's okay to be here. So if we look at this, let's look at children's independent mobility. This is actually what my PhD was on. I was very interested in risk and fear and why parents don't let their kids out to play. And I don't know if this has one of those red lighty things. Oh, it does. Here's Australia. About 30% in Australia, kids walk to school or come home from school independently. This is usually about entering into high school, sometimes grade 6. If you look at other places, like Tanzania, it's about 90%. Cape Town, South Africa is very different. It really depends on whether you're in one of the poorer or richer areas, but on average it's 50%. And then when you look at Sri Lanka and Japan, they're quite high. Canada, US, and UK, they're really low. One of the things I always ask myself is why? Why? Are we really that unsafe in Australia? Really? Let's look at the reasons. The reasons that you have in Australia is primarily traffic and crime. And amazingly enough, it's one of the key reasons in other countries as well. I'm sorry, I don't have as much data for this. This is from data I did with colleagues. So we're not as easily internationally acceptable to move to the other countries. But one of the things I find amazing, over 60%. How many of you share these fears? If you have kids, how many of you share these fears about letting, let's say, a child over 8 years old walk to the shop or do things on their own? Be honest. I mean, this is emotional here. This is existential crisis. You want your child to reach adulthood, right? And yet, there's less fear in Tanzania. There's less concern in Japan. There's high in Cape Town, South Africa. So why is it? Well, a lot of us know that there's this issue, this sort of perception of where things occur, the perceived danger and actual danger. But I think it goes beyond that. I call it the 0 or none rule, or 1 or none rule. And that's basically, it doesn't matter what statistics you've been given. If you have a child, it's either my child or not my child who gets hurt. And you respond to that. And that's understandable. And that's the worry that's often manipulated by media, by politics. And it's difficult because to try to make these decisions, to go against that concern, to go against what you see on the streets, which is often not many kids walking or cycling by themselves. So let's look at some statistics here. They're as accurate as I can get them based on international. When it comes to homicide rates, we don't really have as much to worry about as South Africa, which is up over, let's say, 30 per 100,000 people. We're actually very low. Lower than the United States, lower than Sri Lanka, and lower than Tanzania. About the same for UK and New Zealand. Sexual assault rates per 100,000. Well, we're quite high, but as sexual assault in each country does keep different tabs, and it's about reporting, and this is a difficult one to assess. However, at the same time, you can still see that Australia, although it's not great, is still lower than the US and South Africa and the UK. And if you look at traffic fatalities, once again, Australia is actually quite low. So is that safe enough? Is that safe enough, and what does that mean for us as a society if kids are being trained to be scared of their cities, to be scared when they're out there? I have done consulting with kids in Brimbank where 3-year-olds were telling me they can't play in their front yard because a stranger will come and steal them. So in terms of social learning, what is it that we want to create? I studied on more than 300 policies from international to local level. And when it comes to kids and their ability to deal with strife or risk, hazards, basically, most of the policies see that kids are vulnerable and incompetent to deal with a hazard that affects them, leading to long-term damage. It's not exactly the best message. And I understand what happens. We want to get money for certain programs in order to be able to instigate interventions to really help those who are needed. However, there is a problem, because at the same time, we're also saying that kids are vulnerable and incompetent, and they're creating their own hazards or events that lead to long-term damage. The thing I don't like here is that notion of long-term damage. Long-term damage. The reason why is because it takes away what our histories are. It devalues who we are and what we might have to offer. And it sets us up in many ways for failure, instead of dealing with whatever trauma's happened and saying, okay, but there is something beyond this. Now, I'm not saying that individual workers believe this, and I'm not saying that this is what is taken down on the ground between the people who work with those who've experienced traumas and the families and the communities around those people with trauma. But this is how it's really set up in policy. And for me, that's a problem. Because I know for myself, I didn't have the perfect upbringing, but I wouldn't like to think that I'm long-term damage. I know I have personality dysfunctions at times, and I'm have social issues, and I get nervous and a bit awkward. But you know what? I've also learned compassion. We have the new term, resilience. I can bounce back. I teach at a university. I have students who come in with either depression, anxiety, someone's committed suicide in their family. One of my students has 2 brothers in the prison system. Do you know what? They can talk to me. Why? Because I've had experience. I was a middle-class kid who's had experience. I'm a middle-class kid who, during a divorce, ended up in one of the ghettos in Toronto, and then I've also lived at the other end of town. What does that give me? It gives me experience. It gives me an understanding of humanity. And so in which case, I think that there's a lot of positive things to be looking forward to. And the reason why is because just because something has happened, and just because certain people are born into certain communities or certain families, and it makes it difficult, if we all really seriously think about it, there is a potential for a positive future, and with the right support to move forward. However, within policy, we have to make sure that in the past, where it's always mostly been focused on the at-risk worst scenario and the statistical average was left alone, we have to make sure that with policy, we're not getting rid of the average. Because when we start moving in our focus toward the more competent kids, or some things that you can struggle with but get through, we're taking money and focus and resources away from some groups and some individuals who really need our support. And that happens in the school system. It happens in our communities. It happens with how we're dealing with things in everyday life. And so for us, it also means how we deal with each other in public space. So I guess really what it comes down to is parents and guardians, when they're balancing risk, are worried about, okay, well, if their kid goes out, engages in the community in ways that we say was in the past because things were different in the past often, this is what they're afraid is going to happen. However, at the same time, what sort of urban citizens do we want to model? What sort of urban citizens do we want our kids to become? This is a really important issue for me. Why? Because one day I'm going to be old, and these kids are going to be designing cities for me, and designing cities for you, and the cities that you live in. And so if we're creating cities that kids are scared of, if we're creating cities where well-to-do kids are scared of the poorer kids, or one culture is scared of another culture, it's not going to be the type of city we want to live in. And to engage in public space with people who are different is inherently risky. It's inherently uncomfortable. It then calls into question, what does it mean to be safe? So I figured, in addition to looking at, that was previous research and conceptual research, let's look at what kids see. Kids like old houses. Old houses are creepy. No, they aren't. They bring back memories. Different perceptions, different feelings, different ways of engaging. I like old houses. I like new houses. Fences. Which fence do you think people like? Show of hands. The first one. Yep. Who prefers the second one? Oops. The third one? The fourth one. Do you know what? Kids like these two. Why? They can see over them and see through them. They feel safer. That's about engagement. The other two make them feel unsafe. No one can see us. A dog can jump out. Right? That's the uncertainty that they don't want. Sometimes there's less uncertainty in seeing and being transparent and having that uncomfortable interaction. This is looking at shops in a street. So kids, they love the bakery and the video shop. However, the alleyways are scary and frequented by drunk people, and that made them feel uncomfortable. However, I know with the teenagers, they said that they used to run through the alleyway because it was the shortest distance to subways. Right? We choose. Things might be a bit scary or uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean we don't engage with them. So what does that mean for feeling safe? So I'm not used to this pokey thing. Skate park. Right? Our notions of safe. What's safe during the day? What's safe at night? One of the kids said, I sometimes go by myself and I feel good there, except when there are boys there because they swear and smoke. Or someone else doesn't feel safe, they might slip into the water. There's a lake in this area. Down at the bottom, just so you know, this is not feeling at all safe and feeling very safe. And the dark brown is the skate park, whereas the lighter brown is the lake, and the gray is the park. The thing to consider here, though, we're dealing with different ages. We're dealing with different individuals, all of whom feel safer or unsafe based on different memories and experiences. So if you look at a street, even crossing the road, cars fly along here. I wouldn't want to walk across by myself. Crossing is sometimes dangerous because it has a skinny pathway in the middle, and we can't all stand. It's difficult with mum. So if you look at it, once again, you have an assessment of streets down here at the bottom, and the light gray looks best. It's easiest. However, the third street, this one, is the easiest to cross, and that's the one that feels safest. So what we're starting to find is that not only do we have kids, whether parents want to let them out into the street, when kids get out into the street, whether they feel safe or not, we're not used to seeing kids in the street. And so we use our spaces differently, drivers versus kids, and we can see that we start to have all these conflicts and these fears. And I know I'm talking about this in a bit of a messy way, but it's because I find this a really messy topic. It confounds me. If you look at different environmental things as well, rubbish and excrement, how does that contribute to a sense of safety? For kids, it makes them feel unsafe. Right? We know about this. SEPTED knows about this, about maintaining areas to make them look clean. Traffic, crash statistics. We know about speed of traffic and how it makes people safe. We have all of these cues, but what does it actually mean? When I have international students in country areas, Australians might think it seems really safe. International students often feel unsafe because there's not enough people. So we're dealing with these conflicts all the time. And then there's things that may not necessarily make kids feel unsafe, but it's an annoyance. For some kids, the skate park is where all the bong heads go and smoke rats go, right? Once again, it's that group. We start to see the self and other. And it's convoluted because some of those kids who were scared when they were younger might become those very kids who are the bongs and smoke rats. So how do we deal with it? This slide is this slide's actually particularly interesting for me because these were from kids at a secondary school living in Bendigo who went to the school where it wasn't a private school, but it would be where the income status is a little bit higher, right? They go to a local mall, and for them, they're talking about the mall, and they really distinguish themselves from the mall rats, bus rats, smoke rats, whatever they are. Those other young people who are different from themselves are rats. And one of the things is, they said, okay, well, how many times are there undesirable people at the mall? Over 60%. They're there all the time. Okay, well, does it feel safe? Well, actually, it's neither safe or unsafe. This is just over 40%. A few said it was feeling safe or very unsafe. And then I thought, okay, well, I'll ask, who are these unsafe people? So although young people are talking about mole rats all the time, you have young people here, you have young adults, but here's the interesting, all ages. Okay, how do we make cities safe when people are sort of scared by everybody? See, I'm lucky, I'm a planner. I'm a planner, so I get to deal with these sorts of issues. I'm not dealing with what's happening in people's homes every day. I'm not dealing what happens when there's a small community beset by, drugs or public violence or domestic violence. But I am charged with the fact of trying to teach young planners how to think about their cities in a way that's different from their own backgrounds. Because usually in planning, it's still very much a middle-class white profession in Australia. And it's starting to change, but we live in a really multicultural society. And we're living in a society where there are fewer and fewer kids out on the streets and going places and using their environments. So how do we create that familiarity? How do we create that mixing besides at the local football or at other places? And it's of a concern because if Sutton is right, the socialization of kids, especially well-to-do kids, into fear of the other contributes to the increasing need to be separate, which in turn leads the next generation of adults to engage in higher levels of destruction to the physical and social fabric of society to maintain their separateness. And for me, that is the very core or essence of why we're here today and why it's so important that we're having these discussions. We cannot create safer communities, so to speak. We cannot engage in positive ways of dealing with community crime prevention if people are too scared to engage with each other. How much time do I have, just out of curiosity? 15 minutes, good. I hope to be finished before the 15 minutes because part of the reason why I come here, I actually want to know some of what you think about your city. So as I'm talking, I am quite happy if you zone out a bit and relate it to your own life and your own work. Because the only thing that keeps me grounded in my work as a researcher are all the people who I speak to. So turning to a different group of people, I'm going to look at migrants because, by the way, I would like to thank, it didn't come out, sorry. Obviously, I would like to thank the Community Crime Prevention because they're the ones who provided me with a grant to complete this research. But I want to speak about migrants because, as with kids, it really highlights our notions of safety, risk, insecurity, because we create a public knowing of risk based on notions of specialization, age, gender, social status, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, ability, and so forth, to determine how, when, where, why people are allowed to use public space. And because of this, our values, beliefs, experience, and worries means that we all have different opinions. And for me, what's really important to remember is for all of us in our community and crime prevention activities is that we're also planning for a future of diversity. And that means we have to deal with the challenge of what it means to plan for difference. How do we recognize other people? How can we respect these differences? How can we ensure there's some sort of equitable distribution of wealth? And within that wealth, we can bring in that notion of safety. And when I say safety, in that sense, at least having an environment to which our capabilities somewhat match so we can make decisions that protect ourselves or allow us to the best of our abilities to create the lives that we want to. And part of that is in facilitating positive encounters in public space. Just before I continue, though, I just want to very quickly talk about what multiculturalism is. And that's because there's many different, I guess, definitions, as there always are. But it's about our demographic makeup here in Australia. It's also a set of norms and principles. And it's also a strategy for what we're trying to achieve in Australia. However, when we're engaging in multicultural planning, we're simultaneously doing two things. One of them is trying to create greater acceptance, also trying to create greater inclusion, but in doing so, we can also create greater separation. And the reason why is because, once again, we're dealing with diverse society. Some people love multiculturalism, some people feel threatened by it. So how do we manage these differences? I'm not quite sure, but that's the challenges that we have, because, once again, we're faced with this notion. Are our cities comfortable for who, when, why, how? And who do we choose are the beneficiaries of it? We did this research in Shepparton and Bendigo. This is the just very, very short review of what's in Bendigo. You can see throughout the sites, the green is are the places where people felt quite safe, the brown not so safe. Often they're in similar areas, depends on day or night activity. But when we're talking about safety, one of the interesting things that I have found out of my research, and what I'm going to talk about won't necessarily match the slides. I'm going to trust your ability to multitask here. What I found with migrants, and this research was done with international students, people with a refugee background, as well as skilled migrants, people who've been in Australia for 20 years, people who've been in Australia only a year or so, and most were non-Anglo, non-European migrants. Most migrants felt safe in both Shepparton and Bendigo. Most migrants felt safe where Anglo or domestics or naturalized citizens felt safe. Where they felt in danger were often places with poor lighting, vast expanses of car park, liked areas where there was cars, transport, people, food, activities. And so there's actually quite strong similarities. However, there were some differences that we need to be aware of. Some of the migrants didn't feel comfortable in Bendigo due to all the gangs. How many of you knew that there was a gang problem in Bendigo? Do some of you find that? Well, there actually isn't a gang problem in Bendigo. The fact is, a lot of new migrants cannot read the social cues. So, emos, what are they? Emos, goths, what are the other terms that we have? Obviously, the mall rats that the teenagers were talking about. They're seeing these people who are just hanging out in groups because they're young people, but it's scary because they appear like gangs. So we have those sorts of conflicts. But then there's other things that play into it. Here's the train station. As you can see, lighting and space. And that is, for many migrants, if they feel that they've experienced subtle discriminations or racial incivilities in finding housing, going to work, or their children at school, that gave them a pervasive sense of feeling a bit insecure in the general urban environment. Because in those private or semi-private spaces, if people are going to treat them poorly, what's going to happen in public space? One of the things or indicators that we have embedded in our environments are bumper stickers. How many of you have seen bumper stickers? If you don't speak English, go back to your own country. Right? What about the newspapers? You know, what are some of the things that you can think of that you read about in our daily politics, about who belongs in Australia, who doesn't, about dole bludgers or all these different peoples or others? What it is within our environment in so many different and sociocultural ways, we are given specific messages. And whereas it might make some people feel safe to point the finger and to know that it's being acted upon by governments talking about certain policing initiatives or other community activities, it also makes the people who feel the fingers pointing at them feel just as uncomfortable. Are they safe in our society? And so I guess one of the things that I'm really concerned about, if we keep talking about our lack of safety, the need to make our transport safer, the need to make cities safer, we're always talking about safety as an aspiration. We're overlooking how safe we are. And if we're starting to make decisions based on the lack of security, and our notions of the lack of security are much greater than they are Are we making the best decisions on a daily level? So this is just a little bit more about transport. Some feel unsafe, some sit by the drivers to feel safe. Generally, participants do feel safer, but they also, heard comments go back to China, even if they're Malaysian. Or Muslim women who particularly cop the brunt of people who are willing to express their own uncomfortability with difference. And we all have a part to play in this. And our media, of course. So where does that leave us? Well, like I said, I guess as a planner and also my interest isn't necessarily the people who are vulnerable or who experience violence or crime directly. What I'm interested in are all the people who may not experience that, but how they contribute to a general pervasive sense of belonging or lack of belonging in a city, and how they contribute and how we as individuals contribute to our decision-making and our daily behaviors. Now, if you want an answer to that, I don't have it. However, this is Shepparton, by the way. I might just go through Shepparton because it's just pass through because it's quite similar to Bendigo. However, there are some things that I think can be done. And I know keynotes are supposed to be more aspirational, so hopefully I'm hitting that note, but I also know you want some practical outcomes here. What can we do? Now, this policy comparison between Bendigo and Shepparton makes Bendigo look bad, and I apologize if it, to Bendigo, but the difference is Shepparton has a longer history of migration, and it's been more intense. They've had to deal with their community in a different way. But if we're looking at what we can do in terms of increasing a sense of belonging, increasing familiarity, and joint social learning, so that in this diversity and this mass of what Australia is, to go to a future that's positive, there are some things that can be done, and which Bendigo is actually working on. It's just that its migration history is a bit different. Festivals and ethnic restaurants are important, but they aren't enough. We need movies. We need these cultural symbols and activities in our cities, for sure. However, we have to go beyond that. We actually have to look at what it means in terms of our expression of art, how we embed the diversity of our community within our actual physical environment. It can be as simple as signage. It might be art embedded in through building design, subtle indicators of the local communities who live in that area. It's about ensuring leadership. It's about in all of our professions doing the outreach to make sure that we're definitely representing our communities. It's about including, and in this research, children of migrants, in decision-making processes, so they have a real influence. It's not just about attracting skilled labor so that we can benefit. It's about actually seeing whether someone comes to Australia as a refugee, as a skilled migrant or a student, what they have to offer, but making sure that they have the proper educational, housing, and employment support so that as quickly as possible, they can become part of the community. And this is really, really subtle. This is beyond just regular crime prevention. And some of you, through the talks I've heard today, are already pointing in these directions. But it's not just us as professionals. It's about reaching out to that broader community who really don't see that they have a role to play, when really they do. So, well, I guess what can we do? Reflect our diversity, address economic polarization, public transport. I know that I didn't talk a lot about public transport, but I really believe it's the answer to a lot of our problems. It's a place of mixing. It allows us to move places. It is actually a really democratic space in many ways. But I think the most important thing is that we really can create the cities we want, but we can't focus on the problems. We need to really focus on what we want, how we're going to get there. And instead of seeing problems, we need to see challenges. We need to understand that we really can find solutions. We can work together. And it means we have to reevaluate what are our notions of personal and collective risk management. Where do we want to spend our funds? Do we want people to go into their private homes, their private cars, and only deal with neighborhood safety by protecting themselves? Or do we want to look at other things, like lowering traffic speeds so maybe more kids walk to school? Those things that don't seem to have a direct influence, but gets people out in the neighborhood. Brimbank did some amazing things. They put games like hopscotch and things on some of their public sidewalks so people get out in the street to play. How do we get people out in the streets to play where we recognize that there are different ways of using public space? And I think that ultimately this requires a deeper and ongoing conversation. What does this mean to be inclusive? What does that really mean? Because in order to be inclusive, and in order to have a place where we want to live, it may not be as safe as we want it. And we might be really uncomfortable on the journey to get to where we want to go. But within that, we really have to balance out what is safe enough. So I ask you, and that's the thing I want you to really think about, what is safe enough? So thank you very much for my wandering and listening to my wanderings. And